The letter arrived on a Tuesday in April, 9 weeks after Aunt Vera told us we had until the end of the month to find somewhere else to be. It came addressed to both of us, which surprised me. Most of the correspondence that found its way to Vera's mailbox since our mother died in January was addressed to her alone, or to the estate of, which is the legal phrasing for a person who no longer occupies the paperwork attached to their name. This envelope had our names on it, written by hand in ink that had dried the particular shade of faded blue that suggested it had been mailed well before it arrived. Callie and Marcus Marsh. Not a misdirection. Not a typo. Us. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Marcus brought it in from the mailbox without opening it, which told me he had been paying attention to my rule about other people's mail, even when the other people were Vera and Dale, and we were living in their guest room on the condition that we didn't cause trouble. He handed it to me and sat on the edge of the bed and watched me turn it over. The return address was a law office in a place I had never heard of. Kimball and Associates, 14, Harbor Road, Halston Bay, Massachusetts. I didn't know anyone in Halston Bay. My phone told me it was a small town on the Cape and shoreline, the kind that showed up in travel guides written by people who drove out in autumn to photograph the boats. I opened the letter. It was about property. The letter was signed by someone named Howard Kimball and written in the measured, formal language of a man who had spent his career choosing words for their legal weight. He explained that he was the attorney for the estate of one Silas Marsh, formerly of Halston Bay, who had died in February at the age of 79. He explained that Silas Marsh was our great-uncle, our father's brother, a connection so distant and so long unspoken in our family that neither Marcus nor I had ever heard the name. He explained that Silas had left us everything he owned. Everything he owned consisted primarily of a structure known as the Marsh Ropewalk, a building of approximately 1,200 feet in length situated at 6 Wharf Street in Halston Bay, on a parcel of land comprising the building footprint and the narrow strip between Wharf Street and the waterline. The property had been in the Marsh family since 1847. There were back taxes. Silas had stopped paying them 6 years ago, and with penalties and interest the amount owed to the town was $38,400. Howard Kimball noted that a development company called Harbor Bay Partners had expressed interest in paying the outstanding taxes and offering an additional $10,000 for the deed. He said he was obligated to present this offer. He was also obligated to tell us that the building had been condemned for occupancy, that the structure required significant investment to meet code, and that in his professional opinion, the offer was reasonable given the circumstances. He closed by saying that the property could be transferred to us for a nominal consideration of $5. The decision was ours. Marcus read the letter after me, sitting on the edge of the bed with the afternoon light behind him. "We have a great uncle," he said. Not what I expected him to say first. "Pat," I said. He looked at the letter again. "Why didn't Mom ever talk about him?" I didn't have an answer. Our mother had not left us a guide to her family's map or to our father's. She had been someone who moved forward without a great deal of looking back, and now she was gone, and the looking back was something we had to do on our own from what little remained. Our father had been gone for years before that, left when Marcus was 3 in a way that didn't include forwarding addresses, and what remained of that side of the family was a last name and the occasional Christmas card from our grandmother before she too died. Silas Marsh had been somewhere out there the entire time, a great uncle in a town on the Cape and shore. And now he was gone as well, and he had left us a building. Our father's side of the family was something I had thought about less as I got older rather than more, which was probably the wrong direction, but was the direction that came naturally when the alternative was spending energy on people who weren't present. Dad had left when Marcus was 3. His parents were dead. His family, whatever there had been of it, had never reached out in the years since, and we had never tried to find them, partly because our mother hadn't wanted us to, and partly because when you are very young and someone disappears, you eventually stop facing the door they left through and learn to look at what's in front of you instead. Silas had been in front of neither of us. Why did he leave it to us? Marcus said. That I couldn't answer either. What I knew was that Vera had given us until the end of the month. That was 18 days away. Marcus was 16 and I was 18, and we had no car, no jobs, and $412 between us. The state had a program for people in my situation, newly 18, not employed, caring for a minor sibling, but the processing time was longer than the time we had. And Vera had not said we could stay while we waited. Vera had been clear about the date. We had 18 days for $100 and an offer of $10,000 to sign over a condemned building to a development company we had never heard of. Or we had the Ropewalk itself, whatever a Ropewalk was, on a street called Wharf in a town on the coast. I called Howard Kimball's office the next morning. His assistant, a woman named Ruth, scheduled me an appointment for Thursday. I didn't sleep well Wednesday night. Marcus did, the way he always slept, completely and immediately, which had been something I envied about him since we were children, and he was the one who could fall asleep in any chair in any house, and I was the one who lay in the dark accounting for things. We took the bus. 2 hours, 3 stops, and a change in Gloucester. Halston Bay appeared around a bend as a low line of buildings along a harbor, boat masts above the roofline, gulls working the air above the fish pier. The bus stop was on Main Street beside a hardware store. We stepped off into the April cold with the particular quality of coast cold, wetter and more direct than the inland cold we'd grown up with. Howard Kimball's office was where the address said it was, on Harbor Road, in a 2-story building with weathered clapboard siding. His waiting room held 4 chairs and a print of a sailing ship, and the particular quiet of places that have handled difficult things for a long time and learned to be calm about them. His assistant Ruth brought us water without being asked. He was a small, precise man in his late 60s, with the deliberate manner of someone who had learned that unhurried people make fewer expensive mistakes. He shook our hands and took his seat and opened the file to a page he'd marked with a paperclip. He walked us through the same information he'd put in the letter, now with figures and documents. The tax delinquency notice, the condemnation order, a letter from Harbor Bay Partners on formal letterhead. Their offer stated plainly they would pay the tax debt and transfer $10,000 upon signing. The building has no commercial value in its current condition, he said. What they want is the waterfront access, the land. What was a Ropewalk? Marcus asked. Howard Kimball looked at him with the mild surprise adults sometimes showed when a teenager asked the specific question rather than the general one. A building where rope was made, he said. Before industrial production, rope had to be made by hand in very long structures. The length let the fibers be stretched and twisted into continuous lengths without buckling. The Marsh family built the original structure in 1847. They operated it for roughly 100 years. Until when? I asked. Silas closed it in 1953, he said. He was 9 years old. His father had been running it on reduced capacity for several years. The synthetic fiber industry changed everything. A building that had been closed for 70 years. Longer than our mother had been alive. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photographs he had taken for insurance purposes when he took on the estate. A long, dark interior, 12 feet wide by his estimate, running from the camera into the far distance. Wooden frames, iron machinery, dust on everything, but the timbers looked solid. And at the far end of one photograph, a wall of old brick where the corridor seemed to terminate. I pointed to it. What's that? Silas mentioned he had sealed off the east portion of the building, Howard Kimball said, and something in how he said it was slightly different from the rest of his delivery, slightly more careful. He told me he had made some modifications and that what was inside was sensitive to humidity. He said it should not be disturbed without care. Those were his words. Did you ever go in? Marcus said. He didn't invite me in, Howard Kimball said. Not defensively, just honestly. We want to see it, I said. He drove us to Wharf Street in a clean, quiet car. We turned off Main Street past the Marine Supply and a lobster restaurant not yet open for the season, and Wharf Street came up on our left, a narrow road running between the buildings and the waterline. At the end of it was the building. I had tried to picture it from the photographs and from what I'd read on my phone on the bus. Surviving ropewalks were genuinely rare, the articles said. Most had been demolished. The ones that remained were considered architectural and industrial history, buildings that no longer made sense in the modern economy, but held something in their structure that the modern economy couldn't make again. None of that prepared me for the scale of it. It was not tall, 20 feet at the roofline, maybe less in the settled sections. But it was long in a way that changed how you saw the street. 1,200 feet of weathered wood and old brick running along the waterfront from one end of Wharf Street to nearly the other. The roof was uneven in places. The paint had faded to the gray that salt water and sun eventually make of anything. At the near end, A pair of iron-strapped double doors, green with age. At the far end, barely distinguishable from where we stood, a second set. Marcus didn't say anything. He just looked, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand fully before he spoke about them. Howard Kimball unlocked the near doors with a key that fit the hardware well. The doors swung inward on hinges that had been recently oiled, which I noticed because everything else about the exterior looked like it had not been touched in decades. Someone had oiled those hinges. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The smell came before the light reached far enough to see. Not the smell I had braced for, the rot and mildew smell of a condemned building. Something older and drier. Hemp fiber and machine oil and old wood. The stillness of a space that had been sealed against outside air for a long time and had held what was inside it. The way a closed chest smells when you open it. After many years, the interior was a single long corridor, 12 feet wide. The roof above was framed in heavy timber, the beams darkened with age to a near black. On both sides of the corridor and mounted along the center line were the machines that had made rope in this building for 100 years. The spinning frames were iron and wood, their spindles arrayed in rows that ran the full length of the corridor. Some were simple, a single iron arm and wheel. Some were more complex, with gear systems I couldn't name, designed to spin multiple strands at once, the mechanical logic of them visible in their arrangement even under the dust. The twisting jacks stood at intervals along the center, large mechanisms for laying the twisted strands together into finished rope, each one different from the others, older and newer mixed, evidence of a working operation that had updated its machinery across generations without ever clearing out what came before. Along the east wall, wooden bobbins and spools on shelves from floor to ceiling, each one the size of a barrel, each one coated in dust but intact. The smell of hemp was everywhere, dry and faint, like a memory of the material that had once filled the air here. Underneath it, machine oil. Underneath that, something older, the smell of the wood itself, which was old-growth timber that had absorbed 100 years of the work done against it and held it still. Everything was exactly where it had been left. That was the thing that struck me as we walked. Not arranged or organized for storage, but set where it had last been used and not moved since. The last day of operation in 1953 had simply ended, and nothing had come after it. Marcus walked ahead of me slowly. He was reading the machines the way he read things he wanted to understand, looking at the mechanisms, following the connection points with his eyes. "This is all original," he said. "It looks like it," I said. "Some of it anyway." The building had not been stripped. It had not been emptied or modernized or altered. It had been closed and locked and left as it was in 1953, with the full operation inside it. 70 years of stillness had settled over everything, but had not taken it. About a third of the way down the corridor, at shoulder height on the wall, was a shelf holding a row of old tins. The kind that had held tobacco at some point and been reused for storage. One was labeled in dried ink, "Working Log." I lifted it down and opened it. Inside was a composition notebook, its cover worn soft, its pages still dry. The handwriting inside was nothing like Howard Kimball's precise script. It was the writing of a man who put words down for himself and for the record, not for presentation. Some entries filled a full page. Some were 3 lines. At the top of the first page, a date from 11 years ago. At the bottom, a name. Silas Marsh. "That's him," Marcus said, looking over my shoulder. I turned a few pages. The log was exactly what its label said. Records of what Silas had done in the building each day. He had come 2 and 3 times a week in the early entries, less often later. He had been cataloging the machinery, noting conditions, cleaning components, applying preservation oil to iron parts that showed the first signs of surface rust. Each entry was methodical and specific. There were also passages in the margins, things he had noticed or remembered. The history of individual machines, where they had come from, what they had been used for. The contracts his grandfather had held with 3 different shipyards. The names of the men who had worked the frames on each side of the corridor. He wrote their names with care, as if the act of writing them down was the thing keeping them from being fully gone. In the back third of the notebook, the entries changed. Less catalog, more reflection. A man accounting for what he had built and why. On the 4th page from the end, an entry from 3 years ago. East section finished. The original machinery is in better condition than I expected once the cleaning work was complete this winter. I have documented and photographed everything. I have been trying to understand what it is actually worth, not just to me, but in real terms, and I believe I understand now. I am setting it down in a separate document that will go with the key. I don't know who will come. I hope someone comes who is ready to see it clearly. I closed the notebook. Marcus had moved ahead while I was reading. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, 200 feet away, looking at something. I walked toward him. The building did not end in the wall of brick I had seen in the photograph. It ended, or appeared to end, in a brick partition fitted carefully into the existing timber framing. The mortar lines were tight. The surface was smooth. Someone who knew what they were doing had built this partition, had taken the time to do it right. Set into the center of the partition was a door. Iron, set in an iron frame. Its face unpainted and unrusted, secured with a padlock that was newer than everything around it. The padlock was clean. Its shackle moved freely when Marcus touched it. It had been maintained or recently replaced. He said sensitive to humidity. Marcus said, "The padlock is climate resistant," I said. "Look at the finish." Marcus looked. He was quiet for a moment. "He kept this door working," he said. "On purpose." I went back to where we had entered and found Howard Kimball waiting near the doors in the way that a man who has other appointments waits, standing upright and attentive without being impatient. I asked him if there was any mention in Silas's papers of where he kept the spare key to the east section. Howard Kimball was quiet for a moment. "He left a collection of papers with me," he said, "in a sealed envelope marked to be opened only by his heirs. Given that the offer from Harbor Bay Partners was the assumed outcome, I hadn't opened it yet." He paused. "If you're not planning to accept that offer, I suppose it becomes relevant." "We're not accepting it," I said. He looked at me with the considered expression I had already come to recognize as his default when he was working through the implications of something unexpected. "All right," he said. He didn't argue. He just accepted it the way he seemed to accept most things, as new information to be organized. On the way back to his office, he told us about Dottie Pruitt, who lived in the house at the far end of Wharf Street. She had a space above her garage that she sometimes rented, and she had agreed to let us use it for a week without charge while we sorted things out. "She knew Silas?" I said. "Most people in this town knew Silas," he said. Dottie Pruitt was 72 years old with white hair cropped close and the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades watching weather coming off the water and learned to read more than clouds from it. She brought us soup that evening without asking if we wanted it, and she sat with us while we ate and told us about our great-uncle without us having to prompt her. "He was a private man," she said. "He walked to the Ropewalk 2 or 3 mornings a week and came back mid-afternoon. He bought groceries at the co-op on the same day each week. He ate lunch at the Harbor Diner on Thursdays. He was not cold," she said, "but he kept the boundary between himself and other people at a consistent distance, the way people do when they have made a decision about something they don't want to revisit. He never talked about family," she said, "but I knew he thought about it. You learn things in a town this size even when no one says them. He asked me once, maybe 4 years ago, whether I thought it was too late to reach out to someone after a long time. He didn't say who. He didn't say how long, but I remember the way he asked it." "What did you tell him?" Marcus said. She looked at her soup. "I told him it was never too late and that the only mistake was not trying." She paused. "He thanked me. He didn't say whether he did anything about it." "He left us everything," I said. "I know," she said. "Howard told me this afternoon." She looked at Marcus and then at me. "He meant to find you. I think something got in the way and then the time ran short." We didn't say anything for a moment. "He left a notebook," I said, "in the building. He wrote in it that he hoped someone would come who was ready to see it clearly." Dottie set down her spoon. "Then you're the someone," she said. "I've been waiting 11 years to find out who that was going to be." We were quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the harbor made its harbor sounds, the groan of lines under tension, the irregular knock of a boat against a piling. "What do you think is in there?" Marcus said. "In the east section." Dottie wrapped both hands around her mug. "Something worth keeping," she said. "That man spent the last 11 years of his life going in there 2 mornings a week. Whatever it is, he thought it mattered." She paused. "He never struck me as someone who wasted time on things that didn't." In the morning, she gave us the key ring Silas had left with her. It was a small ring with 4 keys, each one labeled in his handwriting. Building near, building far, office cabinet, east section. We walked back to the Ropewalk in the early April light, the harbor still and gray to our left, the building ahead of us at the end of Wharf Street. I had the key ring in my hand. Marcus walked beside me without saying anything, which meant he was thinking about the iron door the same way I was. The east section key was the second smallest on the ring, worn smooth from handling, the way keys get when someone takes them out and holds them and puts them back, not because the door needs opening, but because the act of holding the key is a way of staying connected to the choice it represents. I turned the padlock over and found the keyhole and pressed the key in. It turned on the first try, clean and immediate, the mechanism giving without resistance. The door swung inward. The first thing I noticed was the smell. The main corridor of the Ropewalk smelled of hemp and old oil and the particular dry patience of sealed spaces. The east section smelled different. Cleaner, drier than dry. The kind of air that has been carefully maintained, its moisture drawn out and held at a specific level so that what it surrounded would not change. The second thing I noticed was the light. Not sunlight. There were no windows in the east section. The light came from a row of low-wattage bulbs mounted along the ceiling, battery-powered, wired to a box mounted on the partition wall beside the door with a simple toggle switch. Silas had installed electrical lighting in a space that had no permanent power connection, the same way he had installed it, it occurred to me, in the building at all. He had made the east section self-sufficient, independent of whatever happened to the main building. He had built it to keep working whether or not anyone else kept anything else going. I reached for the toggle switch and flipped it. The lights came up slowly, the way battery-powered systems often do, building from dim to steady over a few seconds. When they held, Marcus made a sound beside me. Not a word, just the sound a person makes when what they see doesn't immediately fit into a category they already have. The east section was roughly 200 feet long, a quarter of the Ropewalk's total length. And it was not the same building we had been walking through. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The machinery in the main corridor was large and iron and stood where it had last been used, covered in the accumulated dust of 70 years. The machinery in the east section was something else. It was older, considerably older. Where the main floor held equipment from different eras, the machines in here were from one era only, the building's earliest decades, and they had been cared for in a way that the machines outside had not. The iron was clean, a different quality of clean from the main corridor, not scrubbed but treated, the surface preserved rather than restored. The wooden components had been kept with something, linseed oil by the smell of it, the grain still intact, no cracking in the joints. A rope-twisting jack near the center of the room still held its tension in the mechanism. The internal spring Silas must have set and wound, still holding after he was gone. The spindles were intact. The gearing had been freed of rust and moved. I could see from the marks on the metal, recently and deliberately. This machinery had not been abandoned. It had been maintained the way you maintain something you intend to hand to someone else in working condition. Along the east wall, for glass-fronted cases, the kind used in museums, held smaller items on felt-lined shelves. Rope samples in different stages of completion, labeled on small cards. Tools. An iron measure for gauging rope diameter, its scale still legible. A tarring iron. A marlinspike that had been used so long it had taken on the shape of the hands that held it. Marcus walked slowly to the nearest case and leaned close to read one of the cards. 1849, he said. This rope was made here in 1849. He dated the samples, I said. He labeled everything, Marcus said. The same words I had said about the notebook, the same recognition, the same quality of attention it named. At the far end of the east section, past the last of the machinery, was a workbench. Not the rough working surface of the main corridor, but a clean bench, its top clear except for three things. A wooden tray holding a small collection of documents in clear sleeves, a flat metal box with a handle, and an envelope. The envelope was addressed to us. In Silas Marsh's handwriting, in the same ink as the working log, in the careful script of someone writing something they intended to last. To Callie and Marcus Marsh, when they come. Marcus reached the bench a step before I did. He picked up the envelope and held it without opening it, looking at our names in his gray uncle's hand. I took it from him gently. I set it back on the bench and looked at the documents in the tray first, because the working log had said there was a document that would go with the key, and I wanted to see the full shape of what Silas had assembled before I read what he had written to us directly. The sequence felt important. The documents in the tray were in labeled sleeves. I lifted the first one. A letter on formal letterhead from the New England Maritime Preservation Society, dated 2 years ago, addressed to Silas Marsh at his Harbor Road address. I read it through the clear sleeve without removing it. The letter was from a woman named Dr. Petra Holland, the Society's Director of Collections. She wrote that she had reviewed the materials Silas had sent her, specifically the photographic documentation of the Marsh Ropewalk's East Section machinery, and that in her professional assessment the collection represented one of the most significant surviving examples of pre-industrial rope-making equipment in the northeastern United States. She noted that complete sets of equipment from the 1847 to 1860 period were extraordinarily rare, that most had been broken up for scrap or lost to fire in the decades following the industry's decline, and that the Marsh collection appeared to be intact in a way she had not seen in 30 years of work in the field. She wrote that the Society would be very interested in discussing acquisition or long-term loan arrangements. She wrote that valuation would need to be done in person. She wrote that preliminary estimates based on comparable collections that had come to market suggested a figure that she was reluctant to commit to in writing without the in-person assessment, but that she was happy to discuss by phone. She had written a figure in pencil at the bottom of the letter, lightly, as if she'd added it as a note to herself rather than a formal statement. I moved the sleeve to catch the light and read it. My hands were not entirely steady when I set the sleeve back in the tray. The second document was from the Office of the Massachusetts Historical Commission, a designation letter, formal and stamped. The Marsh Ropewalk at 6 Wharf Street in Halston Bay had been listed on the State Register of Historic Places in the year before Silas died, in a filing made by Silas himself, with full supporting documentation. The listing described the building as one of 3 surviving intact ropewalks in New England and the only one retaining its original operational machinery. The listing had legal implications, which the letter explained in careful language. A listed property could not be demolished or substantially altered without review and approval. The condemnation notice from the town did not supersede that review process. The development company's plan to demolish and build on the waterfront parcel was not as simple as buying a deed and filing for permits. Harbor Bay partners either didn't know about the historical listing, or they had known and were hoping we wouldn't. I stood at the workbench for a moment and thought about that. The third document was a survey, professional and recent, stamped by a licensed engineer. It mapped the Marsh parcel and the adjacent waterfront, and in the margin, flagged in red ink, was a notation about a recorded easement along the southern boundary of the property. The easement ran to the water. Whoever owned the Marsh parcel held the only legal water access on this section of Wharf Street. The adjacent parcels on either side had no direct waterfront access. Without the easement, the development Harbor Bay partners had planned could not legally reach the water. They did not want the land. They needed this specific piece of land. Without it, their project stopped. Marcus had been reading over my shoulder for the last few minutes. He didn't say anything. He was working through it the way he worked through complicated things, from the structure outward. I picked up the envelope with our names on it. I broke the seal carefully, the wax dry and clean, and took out 4 pages of stationery, densely written in Silas's hand. To Callie and Marcus, the letter began. Not my dear or any of the formulas people use when they don't know how to start. Just our names, directly, the way someone writes to people they feel they have already been talking to for a long time, even if the conversation has only been on one side. I don't know what I expected from a letter written by a man we had never met. I had thought it might be formal, the way Howard Kimball was formal, careful, and precise. It wasn't. He wrote that he was our father's uncle. He wrote that he and our father had not spoken in 19 years, since a disagreement that he described plainly as his own fault, a failing of pride on his part and stubbornness, and the particular inability of men in his family to apologize for things they knew they had done wrong. He wrote that by the time he had understood what his pride had cost, the years had accumulated in a way that made approaching our father feel impossible, and our father had disappeared from the family's knowledge entirely, and there had been no one left to bridge the distance. He wrote that he had known about us. He had heard, indirectly, through a woman who had known our grandmother, that our father had 2 children, a girl and a younger boy. He had known our names. He had thought about writing dozens of times. He had never sent anything. He wrote that he had found out our mother died in January, and that he had sat in this building on a morning in February and understood clearly for the first time what his silence had cost people who had never done anything to earn it. He wrote, "I do not deserve your forgiveness, and I am not asking for it. What I am asking is that you read what I have left you and understand that the last decade of my life went toward making something you could use. I cannot give you what I should have given you earlier. I can give you this." I had to stop reading for a moment. I set the letter on the workbench and looked at the east section around me. The steady low light, the clean machinery, the glass cases with their labeled samples. 11 years of a man coming here alone and doing the work carefully and going home and coming back. 11 years of a decision he could not undo and a way of responding to it that he had found and committed to completely. I picked the letter back up. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Marcus was reading beside me. His shoulder was pressed against mine the way it had been when we were small and sharing a too narrow couch, neither of us moving because the contact was steadying. I kept reading. Silas wrote about the Ropewalk. He wrote about his father closing it and the particular grief of watching a thing that had been built over 4 generations go still. He wrote that as a boy he had understood the building as evidence that his family had done something that lasted, and when it stopped operating he had felt the loss of that as something physical. He wrote that when he inherited the property in his 50s he had walked the full length of it for the first time in decades and stood in the east section, where the original machinery from 1847 was still in place, and decided he was not going to let it disappear. He wrote, "I am not a sentimental man. What I did here was not sentiment. It was recognition. These machines are the only complete set of their kind still in existence." I looked it up carefully. Museums have fragments. They have pieces. They have photographs and drawings and documentation of how the process worked. Nobody has what is in this room. When I understood that, I understood that I had not inherited a burden. I had inherited a responsibility. He wrote about the years of preservation work, the dehumidifiers he had installed, the oil treatments, the documentation project, the letters to maritime historians, the assessment from Dr. Petra Holland. He wrote that the figure she had penciled at the bottom of her letter was the low end of her estimate, and that 2 other institutions had expressed interest since he first reached out, and that he believed the collection could be sold or placed on long-term loan for considerably more if handled correctly. He wrote about the historical listing, about why he had done it. He wrote that he had known for several years that a development company had been looking at the Wharf Street waterfront and that his parcel was the one they needed. He wrote that the listing was not about stopping them. It was about ensuring that when you came, you would have legal standing they couldn't simply buy away. He wrote, "The easement is the piece they cannot work around. I want you to understand that. Before you speak to anyone from that company, they need your property to reach the water. That easement gives you leverage they have not told you about, because they are hoping you don't know it exists." The last page of the letter was the shortest. He wrote, "I am sorry I didn't find a way to cross the distance while I was still here. I am sorry for what it cost you that I didn't try harder. The time ran out on me in a way I didn't anticipate, which is the ordinary failure of people who believe they will have more time than they do." There is a metal box on the bench beside this letter. The key to it is the 4th key on the ring Dottie has. Inside are the complete documentation files for the collection, the correspondence with the institutions, and a handwritten account of the easement's legal history going back to its original recording in 1891. You will need all of it. Take it to Howard Kimball. Tell him what you found. He is an honest man, even when he is cautious. I hope this is enough. I hope it is the beginning of something that lasts. Your great-uncle, Silas Marsh. I set the letter down. Marcus picked it up and read it from the beginning, which told me he had been reading over my shoulder but wanted the full thing himself, his own time with it. I let him read. I looked around the east section, the low steady light, the preserved machinery, the glass-fronted cases with their labeled samples. The phone in my pocket rang. It was Howard Kimball. He sounded careful in the way that had become familiar from the day before, his voice measured, his phrasing considered. "I've had a call from Harbor Bay Partners," he said. "Their representative, a man named Garrett, wanted to confirm the status of the offer. I told him you were still deliberating. He indicated that the timeline was firm and that the offer would not be renewed if it expired. He said that directly? I said. He said it several ways, Howard Kimball said. The clearest version was that properties in this neighborhood had a way of becoming difficult to manage if ownership was uncertain. I thought about what that meant. About what kind of company says something like that through an attorney to two young people who have just inherited a condemned building with no money. We found Silas's envelope, I said. The one with our names on it. A pause. And, we need you to come to the Ropewalk, I said. This afternoon if you can. Another pause. He was an unhurried man, but this pause felt different from his usual ones. Less calculation and more the pause of someone who had been wondering how this was going to go and was now finding out. I'll be there at 2, he said. I looked around the east section again, at the metal box on the bench, which held the files Silas had built over a decade, at the glass cases and the labeled machinery, at the door to the main corridor, which was open now, which had not been open in years. Marcus had finished reading the letter. He set it down on the bench and stood looking at it for a moment. The way he looked at things he was organizing in his mind before he spoke. He thought we might not come, Marcus said. The letter says that, I said. No, I mean he really thought we might not. He looked at the machinery around us. He did all of this anyway, just in case someone did, knowing they might not. I hadn't thought about it that way, but he was right. Silas had spent 11 years preparing something for people who might never show up to receive it. He had maintained the machinery and documented the collection and filed for the historical listing and corresponded with museums and drafted a letter explaining all of it and kept the padlock oiled and the key on a ring with Dottie, on the chance that when he died and the property went into the estate, someone from a family he had been estranged from for 2 decades might hear about it and come. He was betting on us, Marcus said, without ever having met us. I thought about the worn smooth key on the ring. How many times he had taken it out and held it. He was betting on the chance that we existed the way he hoped we did, I said. We didn't have time to sit with that as long as I would have wanted. Howard Kimball arrived at the Ropewalk at 2 in the afternoon with a small briefcase and his usual unhurried manner. We led him through the main corridor to the iron door, which stood open now, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the east section for a long moment without saying anything. I watched him look. He was a man who had been in Halston Bay for 40 years, who had handled the legal affairs of several generations of families in this town, who had walked past this building 2 or 3 times a week for all those years without ever seeing inside the east section. He stood in the doorway, and I could see him reassembling his understanding of something. Then he stepped inside and put on the reading glasses he kept in his breast pocket and began to read. He read the letter from Dr. Petra Allen twice. He read the Historical Commission designation letter once, but carefully. He spent several minutes on the easement survey. He read Silas's letter to us from beginning to end. When he finished, he took off his reading glasses and held them in both hands and looked at the machinery around him. I knew he was working in here, Howard Kimball said. He mentioned it. He never told me what he was doing. He paused. I assumed he was managing the building's decline, keeping the worst from happening. He was doing the opposite, Marcus said. Yes. Howard Kimball put his glasses back on and opened his briefcase and took out a yellow legal pad. The historical listing changes the situation considerably. The town's condemnation notice applies to occupancy, not to the structure's status as a historic resource. Those are 2 different proceedings. He wrote something on the pad. The easement is the more immediate matter. Harbor Bay Partners has been operating on the assumption that they can acquire the parcel and develop to the water. That assumption is wrong. Their representative told you the offer wouldn't be renewed, I said. He did. He also said properties become difficult to manage when ownership is uncertain. Howard Kimball looked at me over his glasses. He said that. What does that mean practically? He thought about it, the way he thought about everything, from the outside in. It means they're accustomed to being the most informed party in these conversations, he said. And it means they're going to discover that they're not. I looked at the letter from Dr. Petra Allen on the bench, at the penciled figure at the bottom. I want to call Dr. Allen, I said, the museum director. Today, if possible. Howard Kimball wrote something else on his pad. I'll reach out to confirm her current contact. Before you do, I want to flag one thing. He looked at both of us. Once you begin conversations with potential buyers or institutions, you signal that you know what you have. Harbor Bay Partners will find out. They will move from informal pressure to something more organized. Let them, Marcus said. Howard Kimball looked at him. The same mild assessment he had given Marcus the day before in his office. This time, I thought, something in it was different. Not surprise. Something closer to recognition. All right, he said, and wrote something on the legal pad that I couldn't read from where I stood. We walked out of the east section together and stood in the main corridor in the late afternoon light coming through the high windows. The light moved differently in here than it had the day before, the angle lower, catching the iron of the machinery differently. Marcus reached out and touched one of the spinning frame spindles as we passed, just a light contact with 2 fingers, the way you touch something to confirm it's real. The building was ours. The machinery was ours. The easement was ours. The historical listing was ours. And somewhere in the metal box on the workbench in the east section was a decade of correspondence and documentation and legal history that Silas had assembled so that we would not walk into any conversation without knowing exactly what we were holding. He had said in the letter that he could not give us what he should have given earlier. But standing in that building, with the April light coming in at its low angle and the smell of hemp and oil in the still air, I thought that what he had given us was more than most people ever received from anyone. Not money, not a house, something harder to come by. The shape of a plan thought through completely, built with care, and left in good working order for the people who came after. Every document, every correspondence, every label on every sample in those glass cases, every oiled hinge and maintained padlock. A man who had spent a decade saying something he didn't know how to say directly, and had said it the only way that remained to him. We had come after. Now it was our turn to do something with it. Howard Kimball found Dr. Petra Allen's current contact information that same evening. He sent it to my phone with a note that said simply, "Direct line, she prefers calls to email." He also sent a second message that said the formal withdrawal deadline from Harbor Bay Partners was now 6 days away and that he expected their representative to contact us directly before then, most likely at the Ropewalk. He was right about that. But the first call I made the next morning was to Dr. Allen. I made it from the space above Dottie's garage, sitting on the edge of the cot while Marcus was still asleep, the harbor visible through the small window in the gray of early morning. I had lain awake for part of the night going through the figures from Dr. Allen's letter and through what Howard Kimball had said about the development company and through Silas's instructions in the last pages of his letter. By 5 in the morning I was done lying there, and I made coffee on Dottie's small burner and sat with it until 6, and then I called. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was clipped and professional in the way of someone whose time is genuinely limited, not performed, the directness of a person who has spent her career moving between the demands of institutions and the demands of the objects those institutions exist to preserve. I told her who I was. I told her I was Silas Marsh's great niece and that I was calling from Halston Bay. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. He told me he had family, she said. He said he hoped they would come. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I told her we had come. I told her we had opened the east section and found the documentation and read his letter. I told her that we had also found the historical listing and the easement survey and that we understood what we were dealing with, or were beginning to. She listened without interrupting, the focused silence of someone building a picture from incoming information. When I finished, she asked 2 questions. The first was whether the machinery was in the condition the photographs had shown. I told her it appeared to be, possibly better. The second was whether we intended to sell the collection or consider a long-term arrangement. I told her we hadn't decided, that we wanted to understand our options before we decided anything. She said she could be in Halston Bay the following Thursday. She said she would bring a colleague who specialized in the mechanical assessment of pre-industrial textile and rope-making equipment. She said they would need a full morning in the east section. I want to be clear with you, she said, before we ended the call. What your great-uncle documented in those photographs is, if the physical condition matches, one of the most significant industrial heritage finds in New England in the last 20 years. I don't say that often. I say it when I mean it. I wrote Thursday on the back of my hand and told her we would have the building open. That same afternoon, Garrett from Harbor Bay Partners arrived at the Ropewalk. He came in a dark blue car, too clean for Wharf Street's salt-weathered surface, and he parked at the near end of the building, and came toward the front doors with the easy confidence of a man who considers most conversations a formality before the outcome he has already decided. He was in his late 40s, tall, with a jacket that looked expensive and a handshake that was practiced rather than natural. He introduced himself as Garrett Monroe, Director of Acquisitions for Harbor Bay Partners. He told us he wanted to discuss the property. He said it with the pleasantness of someone who does not expect the discussion to take long. Marcus and I were both inside when he knocked. Howard Kimball had come at my request that morning, and he was standing near the window at the far end of the corridor when Garrett Monroe walked in. Garrett saw him and registered his presence without visibly adjusting his manner, which told me that the presence of an attorney in the room was not a surprise he had not prepared for. "I won't take much of your time," Garrett said. "I know Howard has walked you through the offer, and I understand you've had some hesitation. I wanted to have a direct conversation about why this is the right decision for you at this point." "We appreciate that," I said. "Before you do, can I ask you something?" He made a gesture that invited me to go ahead. "When did Harbor Bay Partners first begin researching this property?" A brief pause. "We've been looking at the Wharf Street corridor for several years." "This parcel specifically," I said. He looked at me with the careful attention of someone who has just noticed that the conversation is not going where he expected. "We identified this as a key parcel early in our planning process," he said. "It's standard practice to understand all the components of a development corridor." "Because of the easement," I said. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a gull crossed the window light, and the harbor made its usual sounds, and Garrett Monroe looked at me with an expression that I recognized from the way people look when they've made a calculation and the calculation has just revealed itself to be wrong. "The water access," he said carefully. "The recorded easement along the southern boundary," I said. "The one that gives this parcel the only legal water access on this section of Wharf Street. Without it, your project can't reach the water. And without the water access, your permits don't proceed." He looked at Howard Kimball, who had not moved from his position by the window and whose expression conveyed no particular information. "I'm also sure you know about the historical listing," I said. "The Massachusetts Historical Commission designation that Silas filed 2 years ago. The one that requires full review before any demolition or substantial alteration." Garrett Monroe was quiet for a long moment. Then he made a small adjustment in his posture, something that was not quite a shift, but was the precursor to one, the physical gesture of a man who is internally reorganizing from one approach to another. "The listing adds complexity," he said. "It doesn't change the fundamental situation." "It does change it," Howard Kimball said from the window mildly. He had not spoken until now. "It changes it considerably. A demolition permit on a state-listed property requires a full Section 106 review, public comment, and approval from the Commission. That process takes 18 to 30 months on average and has no guaranteed outcome." He paused. "And the easement is a matter of recorded title. You'd need to negotiate a separate access agreement with the property owner to proceed." "The current property owner?" Garrett Monroe looked at me. "We haven't decided what we're doing with the property yet," I said. "But we're not accepting the current offer." He picked up from there and tried several more angles, each one smoother and less direct than the last, the way a man works through his remaining options when the primary ones have closed. He talked about partnership structures. He talked about shared development. He talked about what a realistic assessment of the building's condition and the costs of restoration would show. He was not rude about any of it, which I noticed and set aside. The pleasantness was part of the approach, not evidence of goodwill. Marcus had been quiet through the whole thing, standing near the door with his arms at his sides, listening. At some point during Garrett's second-to-last angle, Marcus turned and looked at the row of spinning frames along the corridor wall, the long iron and wood machinery running away from us in the direction of the east section door. "There's a machine back there," Marcus said, not looking at Garrett. "That's been running since 1847. That's what the label says. Someone put a label on it in 1847, and the label is still there." He turned back to Garrett. "That's what's in this building. That's what you were going to demolish." He didn't say it with heat. He said it the way he said things he had thought through completely and didn't need to argue about, because the thing itself was the argument. Garrett Monroe left 20 minutes later. He left Howard Kimball his card, which was either professional habit or an optimism I didn't share. His car turned off Wharf Street, and the sound of it faded and didn't come back. Howard Kimball drove away a few minutes after that. He said he would prepare a formal letter of response to Harbor Bay Partners and that we should expect their withdrawal within the week. He was right. The letter arrived in his office 4 days later. On the same day, Dr. Petra Alland and her colleague drove up from Boston. Dr. Alland was in her late 50s, compact and direct, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular way of moving through a space that belonged to people who have spent careers assessing things. She shook our hands at the door of the Ropewalk without preamble and walked inside, and stood in the main corridor and looked the full length of it for exactly as long as she needed to before she said anything. "These are original to the building?" she said. "The main frames, yes," I said. "Some of the jacks are from different periods. Silas's log documents when each piece was added." She walked the corridor slowly, and her colleague, a quieter man named Dr. Rowan, walked beside her and made notes. They looked at the machinery with the attention of people who know exactly what they are looking at and understand its value in terms that go beyond money, though money was also in the room, present in everything they were doing. At the iron door, she stopped. "How long was it sealed?" she said. "Since the early 1960s, as far as we can tell," I said. "Silas sealed it when he took on the preservation work and opened it regularly to maintain the collection." She pressed her hand flat against the iron door frame, which was still swung open. She held it there for a moment. I didn't know what she was doing exactly, but it felt like the gesture of someone acknowledging something. Then she went inside. She spent 2.5 hours in the east section. Dr. Rowan spent most of that time on the machinery itself, testing joints and mechanisms, and running his hands along the gearing in a way that was half assessment and half something closer to wonder. Dr. Alland moved more slowly, going from the machines to the glass cases to the documents in the tray on the workbench and back, building her understanding of the collection as a complete thing rather than a set of components. At one point, she stopped in front of the oldest of the spinning frames, the one Marcus had identified the first day, the one with the 1847 label still on it. She put on reading glasses and looked at the label closely. Then she looked at the machine. Then she took the glasses off and held them. "Do you know how many complete sets of this equipment exist in documented collections worldwide?" she said. "None," I said. Silas had written it in his letter, and I had looked it up on my phone afterward to confirm. "Fragments in a few places. Nothing complete." "Nothing complete," she agreed. She looked at the frame again, then at the row of cases, then at the full length of the east section, taking it all in as a thing rather than a collection of parts. The room was quiet enough that I could hear Dr. Rowan's pencil moving in his notebook. "The preservation condition on the iron components is exceptional," she said. "Whatever treatment your great-uncle was using, it worked. We have pieces in our permanent collection from the same period that are in worse shape than these." She looked at the label once more. "He did this right. I thought about Silas coming in here twice a week for 11 years. The oiled hinges, the battery lights he had wired himself, the composition notebook with its careful entries. A man doing the right thing in a specific place for a specific reason, without any certainty that it would matter to anyone besides himself. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." She sat with us in the main corridor when she was done, on the workbench stools Silas had left along the west wall. Dr. Rowan sat slightly apart and wrote in his notebook. The afternoon had gone from gray to clear, and the light from the high windows had changed to something warmer and more direct. She told us what she thought the collection was worth. She told us in 3 different ways. What the equipment itself would bring at auction if we chose to sell outright, what a long-term loan arrangement with her institution would provide in terms of an upfront placement fee and annual support, and what a partnership model might look like if we chose to keep the collection in the building and develop the Ropewalk as a heritage site with the society's involvement. The numbers were not the same. The auction path was the highest immediate figure. The partnership model was the lowest upfront but the most substantial over time, and it was the one she recommended, though she said that carefully and offered it as her professional perspective rather than pressure. She said the building itself had a role to play in this. A surviving operational Ropewalk with its original machinery, in a coastal heritage town, was the kind of destination that drew visitors and researchers and institutional support in a way that a private auction to a single buyer didn't. The collection would be seen. The building would have a purpose. The things Silas had preserved would go on being preserved and go on being known. That was what she cared about. I could see it alongside the professional assessment. What happened to the thing after the transaction? Marcus asked several questions about the partnership model. Specific questions about what it would require from us in terms of access and management, and what decisions would remain with us rather than the institution. He asked them in order, methodically, the way he worked through anything complicated. Dr. Alland answered each one without impatience. And at the third question, she glanced at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, and then looked back at Marcus and kept going. We told her we needed a few days. She said she would have a formal written proposal at Howard Kimball's office by Monday. We walked out of the Ropewalk together into the April afternoon, the harbor in front of us, and the building behind us, and the pale spring light on everything. Dr. Alland stopped at the door of her car and looked back at the Ropewalk's long, weathered face. Your great-uncle kept this alive for 50 years, she said. That's not a small thing. Most of what could have been saved wasn't, because the people who knew what it was didn't have the will or the means to hold on. She paused. He had both, and now you do. She drove away, and Marcus and I stood on Wharf Street for a while, without saying anything. The call from Aunt Vera came the following week, on a Thursday, 8 days after we had arrived in Halston Bay, with a letter and $400 and no plan beyond seeing the building before we signed anything away. I knew she had heard something before she said a word. I could tell from the way she started the call, not with the brisk efficiency she usually used with us, but with a particular careful pleasantness that she deployed when she wanted something and knew that asking directly would not work. She said she'd been thinking about us. She said she hoped we were settled. She said Dale had mentioned that he'd heard something about a property up on the coast, something significant, and she just wanted to call and see how we were doing. I let her talk for a little while. She had a quality in the cadence of someone who had rehearsed the opening but was less certain about what came after, and I recognized the thing she was doing because it was the same thing people had been doing to us since our mother died, framing concern as an opening for something else. We're doing well, I said, when she paused long enough for me to speak. We found the property. It turned out to be worth holding on to. She said she was so glad to hear it, and then she said that if we ever needed anything, family was family, and she and Dale were always there. I thought about the end of the month and the date she had given us. The guest room. The particular way she had said the words as though they were practical rather than unkind. She was not a bad person. She was a person who had looked at two young people in a difficult situation and calculated what she could afford to give, and she had come up short. And now she was aware that the calculation had produced a result she hadn't anticipated. She had also, by telling us to leave, made the decision that sent us to Halston Bay. If we had stayed through May, we might have waited until the Harbor Bay deadline passed and signed the offer because we hadn't had time to find out what we were holding. The door she closed had been the thing that moved us toward the door that opened. I didn't say this to her, and I didn't say it to Marcus, and I held it without needing to do anything with it. I appreciate that, I said. And I meant it, because I did appreciate it. The way you appreciate something that costs the person saying it nothing and is still offered. We'll be in touch. I kept the call short. Not cold. There was nothing left in me that wanted to be cold about it. What there was, instead, was the feeling of having set something down, the way you set down a weight you have been carrying so long you stopped being aware of it, and only notice it's gone by the sudden absence of the effort. Marcus was sitting on the bench outside Dottie's garage when I came off the call. He had a piece of paper in front of him and a pencil, and he had been working through the numbers from Dr. Alland's proposal the way he worked through everything, from the most conservative figure outward, accounting for the back taxes and the code compliance repairs and a reasonable contingency, before he let himself think about what came after those. He looked up. Vera, I said. He nodded once and went back to the paper. We signed the partnership agreement with the New England Maritime Preservation Society on a Friday in May, 6 weeks after we had stepped off the bus in Halston Bay with no idea what a Ropewalk was. Howard Kimball witnessed it. Dottie brought a small cake to his office afterward, which was entirely her own idea and which she presented without ceremony, setting it on his filing cabinet and cutting it into 4 pieces with the same practical directness she brought to everything. The upfront placement fee covered the back taxes entirely, with enough remaining to fund the first phase of repairs. The annual support from the society would run for 20 years. The partnership gave the society curatorial access to the East Section collection for exhibitions and research, and it gave us the rest of the building, which meant 1,200 feet of legally protected industrial heritage property on the Halston Bay waterfront that we now had the standing and the resources to begin thinking about what to do with. Marcus had thoughts about that. He had several pages of thoughts, organized with the same clear structure he brought to everything. He had been reading about adaptive reuse of industrial heritage buildings, case studies from similar structures in other coastal towns, models for how a space like the Ropewalk could function as something that supported itself rather than consuming resources. He walked me through them on the workbench in the main corridor one afternoon, the paper spread between us and the light coming in through the high windows and the smell of the building around us. "We don't have to decide now," I said. "I know," he said, "but I want to understand what's possible before we decide." That was exactly right. That was the thing Silas had understood, too, in his years of working in this building. You don't decide what to do with a thing before you understand what the thing is. You take the time. You pay attention. You don't sign anything until you know what you're holding. On the last Thursday of May, I walked the full length of the Ropewalk alone, early in the morning before anyone else was there. I started at the near end and walked the main corridor at the pace Silas must have walked it, slowly and without hurry, looking at the machines on both sides. The repairs to the near end of the building had begun the week before. 2 carpenters from town working on the roof section that had let water in at one corner. The sound of their work would have been in the building during the day, the knock of hammers and the smell of new wood alongside the old smells. At this hour it was quiet. The building was just itself, the way it was before anyone arrived to work on it, and after everyone left. The light at that hour came through the high windows at a low angle and moved differently than it did later in the day, hitting the iron of the machinery and the timber of the frames at angles that showed the grain and the texture of things rather than flattening them. The smell was the same as it had always been. Would always be, I thought, as long as the building stood. I walked through the iron door into the east section without turning on the battery lights, because the main corridor's morning light reached just far enough through the open door to see by, dimly, the outlines of the oldest machines in the building. The 1847 spinning frame, the first of the twisting jacks, the glass cases along the wall. Silas had stood in this room many times at the beginning of a morning, before the light changed, before he started his work for the day. He had stood here for 11 years, in this specific quality of early light, looking at what he had kept alive. I thought about the key, the worn smooth key on the ring, taken out and held and put back. Not because the door needed opening, because the act of holding the key was a way of staying connected to the choice it represented. He had made his choice. He had held it for 11 years. And on a Tuesday in April, a letter had arrived in a mailbox in a town an hour from the coast, addressed to 2 people he had never met, and we had come. The way he had bet we would. The way he had spent the last years of his life building toward, on the chance that someone would. I stood in the east section in the early morning light, and I understood something I hadn't quite found words for until that moment. The building had been waiting, yes. The machines had been waiting. But the real thing that had been waiting was the chance that what Silas had done with his years could mean something to someone who would receive it and carry it forward. The chance had come in. The door was open. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.